We all have our inner demons, but usually those are in the metaphorical sense. Our next guest, on the other hand, is here to tell us all about the real deal. Please welcome Bishal Dutta, the director of the upcoming horror film, It Lives Inside.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks for joining me. I got to see this before it came out. I feel very special for that. And I found a lot of things to relate to in it. So we saw in so many instances in it the subtle way Sam tries to assimilate in order to fit in. She shaves her arms. That was a really striking opening scene. She chooses to anglicize her name, and she begrudgingly, kind of performatively, speaks Hindi for her friend. What did it mean to include these moments?
I think a huge thing for me while making this movie was trying to be truthful about what it's like to be Indian American, and really more than that, what it is to have the diaspora experience in America, right? And so someone recently asked me, is this an Indian film, is this an American film? And I think it's very important to me that it's both. It's an Indian American film because that's my identity, is to be in between both. And it really felt like there was a unique version of the story to be told from that point of view, because it feels like we tell these stories from a very binary point of view, and that was the primary conflict.
But it's not binary.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. That you're both, and you're torn between both sides, and how do you reconcile that conflict?
Well, definitely. I mean, I'm not Indian either, but I really related to this movie because we were talking before we sat down here, and my mother is a war refugee, and she chose to give me an anglicized version of her mother's name instead of Sam choosing it herself. So there's this really interesting place to kind of fit in where you don't really fit in either world, and it's sort of about finding your spot. But Sam does have this intense desire to fit in, along with extreme self-awareness of how others see her. So what were your goals while trying to capture what it's like growing up in an immigrant household?
I think that for me, I was thinking about the horror films that I love, right? The horror films that really got me excited about making horror films in the first place, whether it's Insidious or The Conjuring or Nightmare on Elm Street or Poltergeist. I could go on, but I was watching those films as a kid and learning to be American through them. Mm-hmm. But then I started to think, well, what did it look like? What would it look like if it was my family in that kind of story? And so these characters, I'm really trying to kind of bring my own family and friends and cousins and real people from my life into this story, because as you said, I think that the point is for everyone to relate. It's not just about Indian Americans or people who are going through the exact experience as me. It's about connecting to everybody that has lived through this. And I think the incredible partners that I've had at QC Entertainment and Neon, I think that's their goal as well. And together it was this joint goal to make a very universally affecting film that everybody can look at and go, that's my aunt, or that's my cousin, and these are the things we're going through on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it worked with me at the very least. So this was clearly a very personal story to tell, but what was interesting, though, is that the narrative is through the lens of a teenage girl trying to fit in high school. Can you talk to me a little bit about the reasoning behind that, or the conscious choice that you made?
Certainly. I knew that I wanted it to be a high school movie because I think that that's the time when that sort of cultural identity is the least formed and you're trying to figure it all out. But in thinking about it, my thought was, this is a film where the fear is of being gazed upon, of being looked at, and I thought, who better to center that movie on than a woman of color, right? And I think that we're not telling those stories enough, but when I was thinking about the conflict and the fear of this film, I imagined this character and I thought, she is our hero. She is the person that's dealing with this every day, and she's the one that I want to see at the end of the film victorious.
Absolutely. Oh God, when you just said the gaze is the fear. That got me a bit hard. I want to talk about the star of this movie, Megan Suri. So she also stars in the movie, the series on Netflix, Never Have I Ever, which I just finished watching the 4th season of. So these are two very different ways of exploring diasporic culture. What made you choose horror as the way to go through this? Because Never Have I Ever is very light, very rom-com-y. This is not that.
Right. I love that show, and I think it's just so fun, and I've watched all of it, and I love it. With this film, and when I met Megan, you know, she'd been in that show, and she'd been in a wonderful film called The Miseducation of Bindu, and she had done these kinds of roles. But one of the things I remember seeing in Megan, and it was this kind of instant feeling of she's the right person for this role. I obviously saw her as the very likable teenage character at the beginning of the film, but I could also see her as kind of Ripley at the end of Alien, the action hero. And I think that I try to look at both sides of that character arc, and the reasoning ultimately for making it a horror film, I think of horror as, you know, really the most expressive of genres. And I think that the emotions that this film is about, I think if you make it as a straight drama, the audience is outside of it looking in, whereas this was an opportunity to take these very real feelings. And as a teenager, it does feel like the end of the world. It does feel like you're living...
All those emotions.
Yes, you do feel like you're living in a horror film. And so the thought was, okay, this feels like the most authentic and truthful way to convey these emotions that this character is going through.
I mean, I was watching this, and I was thinking about other teen horror movies that I've seen, but there was a stark difference here because we've seen, let's say, in Carrie,
yes,
there's characters who are unbelievably cruel and just so not redeemable at all, just awful people. But when Sam, you know, does something a little mean in this, she seems to feel immediately regretful. Is that something you thought about? Do you think maybe this generation is a little bit different, or what was your reasoning going into that?
I certainly think that empathy is what I want out of characters. Mm-hmm. It's what I look for, and I'm not looking for characters that are perfect. And as I and the co-story writer, Ashish Mehta, and as we were coming up with the story, that was important, that this character was understandable, that though she did something wrong, we understood where she was coming from. And I feel this way about all the characters. I think there was an opportunity for some of the supporting characters to have become malicious or cruel, but that just didn't feel interesting to me as much as this is what's the horror of this film is coming from inside this character. I didn't necessarily want to do the shower scene in Carrie, and as you can tell, I'm sure there's a callback. Our sequence is happening in the shower, you know, the locker room as well. But I think it was more important that in this film, the horror is coming from within the characters.
Oh, it does live inside, doesn't it? It Lives Inside will be possessing theaters stateside on September 22nd, so keep a lookout. And if the jar seems sketchy, definitely don't break it. You'll know what I mean when you watch the movie.